Have you read Sexual Suicide
I haven't. No.
or Men in Marriage by George Gilder, man, that dude,
Yeah,
he's impressive.
he really is.
Um, but one of the things that I was reading from him on Sexual Suicide, Chapter 7, did I tell you about that?
No.
Oh, I can't do it here because this is not what we're going to talk about today. But if I can summarize what I think he did in Chapter 7 of Sexual Suicide, you know how everybody talks about white supremacy and how, how racist America is and it's full of white supremacy and blah, 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 blah. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I don't think that everybody is making a play to try and gain power the same way. I think there's some people who really do feel something, who really do are engaging the world and saying something is a problem and I don't know what it is. And I think that there is a dismissive attitude from some of the my conservative friends to be able to say, well, what's going on? Right? Because everybody's such in a position to play for power that you don't even want to listen to some folks, right?
Right.
But George Gilder, to me, I think George Gilder hits this thing out the park, and he basically goes through Chapter 7 and he starts dealing with uh, kind of the breakdown of the Black home, the Moynihan Report, 1965, and the importance that Black culture has played in American culture. And
Okay.
he basically says that there's not one area of American culture that has not been saturated with Black culture. It's all intertwined. You can't, when you see how they've engulfed with jazz, right? Jazz
Hmm.
has come up and has just taken over. Everything is jazz, right? In one way or another, it's come
Yeah.
from jazz, hip hop, whatever you want to say. And it's prominent. It was extremely prominent earlier in the early 1900s. Really grew, but it was even before that. But it became such a part of American culture. It was like he even talks about the kind of like the first hip hop. He didn't say this, but going through the trajectory that he starts off the whole chapter by saying there's a guy, um, I can't remember the guy's name because I don't have the book here, but who he's quoting, and he says, I wanted, after I became a prominent person in jazz, I wanted to come back to the community the same way a pimp did, where they had the nice cars, they had the nice clothes, and you knew that they were successful. And that was
Right.
the image of this very well-known jazz player. And I was like, that's jazz player supposed to be a high class thing, not like the looking like no pimp. That wasn't the thing. But that's how we look at jazz now. Jazz then was like hip hop. It was
Okay.
way more street. It had a different engagement. It was that's the dude, you know what I mean? Right. So
Yeah, yeah.
it was different. And so that was the persona of this jazz player to come back and to have this type of look. So he basically goes through I'm making this long, but I'll make it short. He basically comes to the end of this whole chapter after breaking down the demise of the Black family, how that social structured programs have removed the male from the family and has created an effeminate culture predominantly in the Black culture, right? And Black society. So there's an effeminacy to the culture because all the institutions are favoring all the institutions are designed to favor women. The man is getting his handout from the woman at the welfare system, right? So from one woman to another woman, and he's kind of out. And he just makes this great connection of how the welfare system really erodes the structure of a family inside the Black community. And he says Black communities and black culture has had this predominant effeminate culture because of this pushing out of Black men. And then he gets to the
Have
end
you
of the go ahead.
have you seen um the new documentary about Tupac?
No.
It confirms that exactly what he's saying. It confirms it. Just
No. Okay.
yeah.
Okay. That's on Hulu, right?
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
I have to go check it out. But here's the kicker. So he gets to the end of this and he makes a great case. And he takes Moynihan's point and he starts saying, this is where he starts bringing in the impact of Black culture to American society. He's like, you can't untangle it from American society. It's everywhere. The sports, the way we talk, the way we engage, music, it's everywhere. So it's not like it's a thing over there. It's just in
Right.
American
Yeah. Yeah.
culture. And he says, but what we didn't investigate when we embraced it was all of the other things that it brought, primarily the brokenness of an effeminate culture because of the way that the America eradicated the Black man from the Black family.
Right.
And so it brought an effeminate, and so because the institutions are made to design for women, it works along with women. It makes men have to leave their so they don't submit their sexual desires, and he's meaning covenant. They don't have covenant relationship with women anymore. So their sexual desire, he says sexuality, is verified by other men, right? So that other men they go find clusters of men that are being hard or the gang, and they get them to validate their dominance, who they are as men, instead of submitting that sexuality to a woman and then bringing forth cultivation of a family and these other things. They get this dominant takeover attitude that's effeminate, right? It's not something that is submitted. It's dominant, which becomes effeminate, and that permeates everything into that they do, right? And so now what happens is you embrace this effeminate culture that has to reject the system because it can't fit inside the system. And so what you get in sports with this dominant attitude and this just like, it's gritty. It has a form of masculinity that has no submission to a wife, no submission to a woman, right? And so there isn't a real covenant relationship. There's just dominance, just pure dominance, right?
Interesting.
And so when you embrace that, what you end up getting is an effeminate culture everywhere, in everything, easily offended, right? Has to be taken care of, has to be managed. And it's not, and this is what Moynihan's point was. If we don't fix, I don't agree with everything he's saying here. I'm just quoting Moynihan.
Yeah.
But if we don't fix the destruction of the Black family, back in 1965, he was arguing this would be the destruction of America. That that effeminate, out of wedlock, predominantly single mom culture would drive crime, would drive unsettledness, would drive the lack of work, would make people dependent on the system, even the outside of the Black culture, because it would go everywhere. And so what I think, and he didn't say this, but after reading all that, what I think most people think that they're feeling when they think they're feeling a white supremacist culture pressing in on them, I think they are feeling something, but they're feeling an effeminate culture that doesn't allow for growth. It's all dominance. It's all effeminate. There's no submission. So then what does growth look like? Well, if you don't know what marriage looks like, if you don't know the man submitting his sexuality to a woman and a woman taking that sexuality and then making children and culture
to one woman,
to one woman,
to one woman, because I think that's what makes the difference.
Well, I don't think there's submission any other way. So you can't submit your sexuality to multiple women.
No, it ends up being submitted to an idea rather, so you end up, and so you see this in when you get something similar that happens when you get like the cultures that are based on like a strong Marian theology rather than Christ, where you get the idealization of women in the abstract, right? But then it leads to men not being expected to control their sexuality, right? So men can sleep around and everybody expects it. Boys will be boys, all that. And but then you look at it and you're like, well, but you've got this idealization of the abstract woman rather than the submission of your body to one particular woman in a covenant.
This is Proverbs.
Right?
Right. That's all this
It
is.
is, right, yeah, it's Proverbs, and I think you think back about, like, the most transgressive thing in the 80s and 90s in Black culture was a "your mama" joke, right? Because you don't joke about
You don't play with mama.
mom,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
You but it was transgressive comedy, you know, for that reason, right? But it's the idealization, right? It's not really like you don't actually have a culture that's really good at showing honor to women in the 80s and the 90s in Black
Oh my
culture,
goodness. Right.
right?
Right.
But you've still got this woman base, there's still a matriarch, right? But a matriarchal culture, um uh that might not be the right way to put it. Yeah, I think a matriarchal,
Nature. I just think, yeah, yeah.
yeah, matriarchal, society, I guess, rather than culture. A matriarchal
Mm.
society um doesn't lead to the honoring of women, right? And it never has, right? That's um the cultures that really honor and lift up women well are the ones that understand their value, understand, see what they're for, and understand and value them, rather than um rather than sort of set them up as the one who's responsible, because that's what a matriarchal society does, is it says mama's responsible, but God sets it up the other direction, right? So
Interesting.
and that's what a matriarchal society is easy to lead around and control and use by the people with
Yeah, they're
power.
submissive to institutions, right? That they're
Mhm,
supposed.
and
Well,
because
it's funny. Women are designed to be submissive. What's the
yeah,
problem here?
yeah, there's going to be but if they're also responsible, right, then
Mhm.
they're going to be looking for somebody that's going to provide, and the government can step in, or the government stepped in and said, hey, we'll provide, and the men were like, hey, they're providing, I don't need to. You're responsible to feed these kids, you're responsible to raise these kids and get them to church, you're responsible, and so when that that that's an unprotected subculture, unprotected
Yes.
society, that and what I mean, you and that it's not the first time that ever happened, right? You had the same thing with the um Spartans, right? It's very similar. The Spartan culture was very similar, um in that you know um the men trained in war exclusively, and then the women were responsible for the other stuff. That culture disappeared. Like, it turned out that that moment in the Spartan culture was the very end of the Spartan culture. It that Everybody looked at it and was like, "Oh my gosh, they're so tough. Even the women fight, and all this." But it turned out to be the very end of the society, because the society that has handed over responsibility to the women in society is a society that's within generations of disappearing.
Ooh wee. Ooh wee. I don't know.
But
We don't need to talk about this show. That's not what we're supposed to be talking about because that's gonna get us in some trouble.
but
You
it
know.
but but I mean, in some ways it is what we planned on talking about.
Well, yeah. This is what
Because
this is.
yeah,
Well, yeah. Let me just say. So Moynihan figured this out in 1965. That part of the mistake that we've made, I think, in some of the conversations that are taking place right now in America around race, is that it removes the idea that we are covenanted together as Americans. So
yeah,
if um, Moynihan could see that, wait a second, Americans are having a problem because of the infrastructure that we're making around them that is going to destroy them, and that is starting to destroy them, because just 15 years before, everything was intact. Matter of fact, the marriage rate was higher than that of white people at the time. And he's saying, wait a second, he wasn't right on everything. He thought slavery was the problem and other things was the problem. There was something else, right? It was the fact that the government came in and took the place of the father in a
Mhm.
particular group of people. And in trying to help, it made them slaves and created an effeminate culture that even man became effeminate. And by the way, they reacted to the lack of being out of sync and being in covenant relationship with women, right? There is a beautiful marriage between the two that you have to build society. And
Right.
when you destroy that bond and put anything else in its place, it doesn't work. And
But
so, go ahead.
there is a so there was actually literal white supremacists though that wanted to experiment on black families on what would it look like for the government to break down
I forgot about
the
them. You're
family,
right. I
right?
mean, I didn't forget about them,
So
but yeah, that was
so I
part of it.
think that there really was a um I mean, there's a really great book um on the
The
history of zoning codes in East Coast cities. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
900 pages on the history of zoning codes and how zoning codes were used to disrupt minority families purposefully. They knew
right.
there were people that knew they were doing it because and it's the same group of folks that started Planned Parenthood, right? Um, that there was an actual conspiracy to destroy minorities and the fabric of minority families so that they could be returned to their quote unquote proper place. Um, you
I don't I
which
You know what though?
so that
I
that
get
really was there.
No,
Now,
you're right. No, you're right. I don't think they were
so
effective though.
in some places they were, and some places they weren't. I think um, it revealed some of it, but something doesn't, living things don't rot. Right.
Yeah,
And so when you have the sudden just crumbling of the black family, it that's not something that you can accomplish from the outside. Right. So that was something that was happening already that
right.
people came along and that there was a crack there and they just said, "Oh, we'll stick our pole in there and we'll wrench on it and we can get the crack bigger." But at the same time, um there's serious bad actors at the federal level. Most of them were at the
Yeah.
federal level.
I I
So
just
and it's just evolutionary thought says somebody's going to be at the top, somebody's going to be at the bottom, and it's a biological question. So it makes sense in their worldview to say we are right. There is a racial rivalry going on, and one of us has to win and one of us has to lose. And so that was a major part of the eugenics movement that got significant inroads into the federal government from starting in the 20s up until the 60s. I mean, the last eugenics law was finally removed from the books in the 70s. The federal eugenics law, it was like late 70s before they finally got rid
Wow.
of the last eugenics law. So,
They just
it,
changed the name with
and
eugenics, that's all.
right, what I mean, you still got the Planned Parenthood was a part of the eugenics movement.
But what is the
They
whole transgender thing? It's all eugenics.
it it is, and you're starting to see uh, an individual scientific eugenics grow as people start to say like, hey, I can get you a boy, I can help you choose, do you want a boy or a girl? I can, those sort of eugenical movements. But you've always had, since evolution, you've had true believers that get into eugenics. Chesterton's book Eugenics and Other Evils um, is really helpful on this. And he's writing the 19 teens, he's starting to write on the evils of eugenics in England. And the problem is the Anglican Church had people teaching eugenics, preaching eugenics, and so when people say like, oh, he became a Roman Catholic, you got to realize how messed up the only Protestant option was in his day. They were going through the modernist movement the same way so it was 20 years, 25, 30 years before American mainline denominations became modernist. The English and German churches are becoming modernist. And he's sitting there watching these Anglican churches go the woke, I mean, basically. And and so he switches to the local Roman Catholic church because the local Roman Catholic priest is the one that's fighting modernism. Right? So but he wrote a bunch about the eugenics movement and its growth in England. That happened here. The difference is the middle America would have nothing to do with it. Most Americans wouldn't have anything to do with it. The abolitionist cause was so successful that there were that a lot of America just outright rejected any sort of eugenical anything. But it didn't mean that there weren't still people in power that were into it. So it is hard when you say, well, there is some, I think that there were people that were making white supremacy moves at the time.
Oh yeah.
But
that's not, but here's what's crazy is that I don't find that a new narrative inside the story that we're talking about with Black people in America. Okay.
No. but I think that conservatives have, well, for one, we haven't done our historical research, right? And so people come along and they're like, oh, there's all this white supremacy, and the left, even though they were the ones that actually did it at the time, have now turned and said that it was the right.
Yeah.
Look what you all did. Look at all that white supremacy. It's like, well, wait, you're telling me that when Planned Parenthood started and they did their Ku Klux Klan tour to raise money and promised to weed the human race of the brown-skinned people, and
Margaret Singer is on with them. Yeah.
Yeah, right. She was the one that was up there giving the speeches, right?
And you guys
right. And
you guys are giving Margaret Singer awards.
Right, yeah. And then they turn to the right and say, look what you all have done, you white supremacists. And they're like, historical, if just a little bit of historical research reveals that it was it wasn't the right that was pushing that sort of stuff. Now, have there been racists on the right? Yeah, we get there.
No, never, not one.
But the solution is not everybody go right. The solution is everybody find Jesus,
That's
who's
right.
not a racist. And then but what we have tended to say, to just respond to the left's rhetoric rather than develop our own positive vision for how we think, what would it actually look like to try and solve some of these problems. I mean, we actually did, because you had like Martin Luther King Jr. out there on the right, trying to give a vision. It was just, I think it was compromised, but he was presenting a vision from the right for a society without the racial animosity. So it's not totally true that we haven't presented a positive vision, but the left went out there and killed him. So
just go toss that one in there like that, huh? It's funny. I always feel like I stand in between the two with these arguments sometimes, where it's like,
oh, totally, yeah.
But part of my reason I'm not pushing back on what you're saying. I know I agree with you and everything you're saying. There is a tendency, because we don't know even how to deal with guilt in the conservative party, that we try to act like nothing ever happened, and like we don't have our own problems in there. Should I say Republicans or the right? So, but what I'm trying to communicate to the right now is that you had a group of people that had all sorts of issues pressing in on them, weren't allowed to vote, couldn't own firearms. You know, the First and Second Amendment rights were completely abolished, weren't given to them.
Mhm.
Second class citizens in America. And if you look at what they were able to produce and the temperament that they gave to a nation over a period of time has been one of the most successful groups of people in America. And they did that. They did that in spite of all the things that the conservatives are fighting for right now to try and preserve. They did that without those things because of some faithfulness, right? Now you destroy,
There was faithfulness.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, you got a smirk on your face, so you want to correct something I just said.
No. They did it with faithfulness, and um, they were and with the artistic muse touched them
Yes,
as a people,
yes,
and that is the way affections are that's the way what we love is changed, is through beauty, right? So it's through the arts. And they so when you look back and you look at when the pressures of injustice produced art that changed and formed the affections of a nation. I mean, they music there. I mean, this goes. Plato talks about this all through, Boethius wrote an entire book about this, right? Music tunes our loves. Art and beauty tunes our loves. And the what God did is through the pressures that were put on the black folks that were, most of whom maybe even were brought here against their will, the pressures that they were put under produced art within them, that then within their society, but it was the best art. And so then it went out and hit the rest of the world, and the rest of the world had their love reorganized by the black artists. I mean, and what's crazy is a lot of it came from the black church, and we don't get that. Is the credit is not given to the black church that should be given to it. If you look at even the Harlem Renaissance and read the actual publishings from the Harlem Renaissance, you realize that was a deeply Christian movement, that the church was deeply involved in the poetry, and a lot of the musicians were trained in church and they were still singing church songs. When it gets published now in the university, that they'll put together, here's all the important poems from the Harlem Renaissance. They only put the secular ones and the socialist ones out as important. Everything else is considered unimportant by modern people, by the present establishment, if it was Christian. But it was deeply a Christian revival of the arts. The same with gospel music, which became rock and roll, which became eventually affects soul music, disco, funk. All of that comes out of gospel music. In fact,
blues, yeah.
You can't even tell that. Yeah, the blues, all of that comes out of the beauty that God's people, who were put under an oppressive, put into oppressive, high pressure situations, and went before the face of the Lord and said, "Rescue us." And they were transformed into artists and musicians and poets. I mean, the only poets in America that are making an income on their poetry are coming out of out of rap, out of hip hop and rap. So I think as a church, there's a lot we need to learn, especially when I suspect that there's pressure coming.
Or yeah, and that's the thing. that was my whole point in bringing that up, was that there is, I don't think you have to be necessarily run underneath that pressure, but if you go clutching for your pearls, um, or in this case, clutching for your false gods. I love a gun. I appreciate guns. I own plenty of them. I'm going to own more, and I'm going to buy a lot of ammo. Bottom line, okay. And First Amendment, defend it, fight for it, go to court over it. Absolutely, I'm for those too. Don't get me wrong, but that's not the thing that I think is my savior, right?
Right.
And so this is why, when I moved to Moscow, there were some things that I realized I needed to develop. And one of the things that I felt like I needed, I knew I didn't have the education I needed to be a man. That was scary, right? And I'm seeing these other guys deal with the same problems I have to deal with, but in a different way. And I'm like, what is clicking in your head that makes you deal with your kids in this manner versus that manner? Or why are the boys just a little more ruckus around here? Like, what, everywhere else I go, I'm used to boys. Hey, settle down. You're always out of spot. Get in line. Do this. The boys are really guarding. Everybody says, "Oh, my boys, my girls do good." Oh, but my boys. That wasn't a theme around here. That was interesting, right? And the education, everything pointed back to education. Everything pointed back to, and then when I got to education, it really, where you kind of started, everything started with passions. And I remember Ben Merkel saying, if you ever missed Christmas, then it should hurt. It should be like, oh wow, I'm not at a place where I have these desires for, because all of your passions and desires were built around the smells and the laughter and around the joy. And so you had this cultivation around the day that you wouldn't want to miss with your family. Talking about Christ, all those things have a certain value to you that if you were to miss that, it would break you, right? And he's used that idea to talk about education. Yeah.
It's the reason the song "I'll Be Home for Christmas" is feels so deep, hits so deep, is because something, not being home for Christmas is hard. It would be really hard if you've got any sort of traditions in your home, because not everybody does, but
right. And then so nobody cares, because who cares? Right. It's just another day, right? So then part of, one of the things we haven't ever really dealt with. What did you had a couple of titles for even today, but we haven't really dealt with education and developing that. And I'm, the whole reason that I'm ultimately here in the Northwest is because of, I'm realizing that there are passions, desires, and my heart isn't tuned to some of the things that I think it needs to be tuned to. And I'm saying, man, my kids, I don't want them being like this. I have to help tune their desires and passions in a different way. And I need this education to be able to do that. And so I don't even know, where do you start? I guess if you're broken like me, where do you start? And then when you have kids, like, where do you start?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is always the question that is so difficult, because as soon as you start studying the history, as soon as if you try to come up with a definition of what is an educated person, you study just a little bit and you realize, oh man, we're in trouble. There's no,
yeah, like, that's how I feel.
We've had to shift and change the definition of words to where you shift and change the standard, basically, by changing the definition of words from something like literate, meaning, a literate person used to be somebody that could that knew their way around the literature of the people of their language that they speak, right? So
oh wow,
if to somebody that can sound out words, which what like, can this person read? You say, well, it used to be like, well, eventually the goal is, somewhere around the 8th grade, you can read, right? You learn the grammar um, so that eventually you can learn to read. But now we settle with, can this person um, sound out a sentence, right? Can they read enough to be to be advertised to? That's kind of our low bar. Um,
And
and
be a cog in a machine.
yeah, exactly. So there is very little literacy. I mean, literacy is functionally zero in our society. Um, the King James
And
version, when I in 1995, the King James version was still considered a 12th grade reading level. Now it's a post grad reading level. Right.
no.
Mm-hmm.
It's so
So
funny. My
it's
my dad
you're no
said if you
longer
could.
you can yeah, go ahead.
My dad used to tell me, he's like, hey, if you can read the King James Bible, you can read anything. My dad was not very literate, wasn't educated very well, and he's like, he learned to read from continually every day reading the King James Bible, and
Yeah.
he used to make us read it.
Well, and I mean, I switched to the King James Bible when I was about 20, 21 for that reason. I realized I wanted to go into um, that I wanted to be educated. I wanted to know literature, and so what was I reading every day? Well, I'm reading the Bible every day. Switch to the King James because I wanted to push my reading level up so that so if you get to if you can read the King James, you can read any Shakespeare. Right um, there are some Shakespearean plays that are considered a higher level than the King James, um, and then most of the common ones are considered a lower level than the King James. But the King James is now considered a post grad reading level, and the reason that they shifted that was because you can't just keep saying like, hey, we're graduating illiterate people from our college. The options are teach them to read and fail a bunch of people, or change the standard. And financially, it failing a bunch of people doesn't work at the college level. But the college isn't the problem. By the time they get to college, they should be literate. They're not anymore. I've heard from seminary professors at big reformed seminaries, we're getting illiterate candidates. Right. There's only so much you can do with 3 years. The by
Oh,
in a
wow.
lot of ways the cement is set and they're supposed to come in literate. Now, at any point in your life, if you commit, you can become literate, and it doesn't actually take that long. But it's a commitment, right? Because it's hard work.
Okay.
And it's
Is it
less
how?
hard when you're young because your
Yeah.
brain's still squishy.
But when you say, you gotta, for me, then define literate again, because you said a familiar with a people's
Yeah,
literature and their
yeah. So
language.
familiar with the literature of your own language. So, in the sense that you can jump in at any point and survive, right? So you can jump in and read at any
To
point.
what?
So
Jump into what and
the
survive?
literature, the literature of your people. So you can jump into 17th century, 16th century, 19th century literature, 20th century literature, and you know enough about the history of the conversation, the literary conversation, that if you jump in and you say like, oh, this book was written in 1930, you know enough about the literature leading up to it that you can jump in at that point and say, okay, I've got an idea of.
We ain't gonna make it. We
No, I
ain't
know
gonna
that's what I'm
make it.
saying.
We ain't gonna make it. Ain't nobody
It's
literate no more.
immediately depressing when you realize that we're all illiterate. We're
Okay. I mean, I knew that
so,
about myself a little bit, but dang.
but what and so I got to go have dinner with a gentleman he's currently um he's currently translating Dante, right, out of the Italian, a new verse, uh um blank verse version of Dante. But and we jumped in and we're talking just Italian Renaissance literature, and I was really excited. and he's brilliant, Reformed Baptist, and he's translating it for a Roman Catholic PhD program, right? So you think like you have to be really good if the Roman Catholics are like, okay, we'll let the Reformed Baptist be the one that does the Dante translation. And he's really, really good. And his Paradiso is about to come out. I've recommended it before. Joseph Carlson's the poet, but he has both studied the history of English poetry and is very, very well versed in English poetry, has written a couple of epics himself in English, and then he's theologically really, really well grounded. And then he has to study the Italian, and to know Italian, you can't just know a single poet in Italian. You have to actually learn a lot of Italian in order to be able to translate poetry. But that's a cross literary mind, because you have to be conversant in multiple literary the literature of multiple languages, as well as the history of ideas, because you're trying to get to be able to do translation at all. And it used to be that so J. Gresham Machen, when he had to do his ordination exam, it was all in Latin. You had to be literate in multiple languages to be able to even sit for an ordination exam, less than 100 years ago in an American church, right? So that's we've fallen a long ways. And in my mind, the first goal is to recover literacy. And then that will open up the eyes of certain people who will say, oh my gosh, what if I was literate in multiple languages, right? What if I grew and was literate in multiple ways? The resources are there. It's the passion, the affections, the love is not there. The love of knowledge is not there. And I think that's where we're stuck right now. What was that line in Good Will Hunting, when he says your Harvard education can be achieved for $250 in library fines or something like that.
It's true.
The resources are there, right? You can go get the education if you want it, and you know that it's valuable, and that is where we're stuck. We don't realize it's valuable, but classical education actually has an answer for that.
Okay.
I'm really excited about it, but I just want to
I got to ask the question. I see that. I'm supposed to ask the question. So what's the answer? Because there's a part of me that's like, oh, that's I've kind of given up a little bit on myself in this, where I'm like, okay, there's some things I need to know and learn, but I'm just gonna give it to I'm gonna try and get it for my kids, because I'm not gonna be able to attain 3 languages before I'm gone here. But that's probably the wrong approach. Maybe I just don't have the passion or desire to do that. I'm just trying to get through my book reading list for this year.
Your kids will value what they see you valuing. So they will value. And my wife and I have been involved in multiple schools, starting an arts conservatory, the different, it's an art school. And what we have seen over and over and over is that the kids who actually really benefit from the school are the ones whose parents are willing to do the work whose parents see that the classical education is valuable and try to get it for themselves also.
Okay,
They're
I
not
got
going to
it.
get
All
it.
right, all right,
They're
I
not
got
going to
it.
get as
That's real
far as their
good.
kids, maybe, because there's more years. But the parents who say, "Oh yeah, I believe classical education is really valuable, so I'm going to pay somebody to give it to my kids, but I'm not going to get it myself, and I'm not going to worry or care." Those kids don't get it either.
So then, when you say classical education, what's the answer that classical education gives, and what is classical education ultimately?
So, well,
Because
classical education, it, the reason we call it classical education is because um, John Dewey and some other folks came along and tried to restart education along what they called scientific lines, the scientific education. And what they meant was the hard sciences, because the word science used to just mean a body of knowledge, um, body of knowledge containing practical and metaphysical truths that were interrelated, right? So there were three major sciences: natural science, moral science, and divine science. And
mm,
so all of them were sciences because they were bodies of knowledge, that you could that had had historical conversations, um, searching the truth generationally. So you have, um, so like the moral sciences would be something like economics, uh, where what does it look
oh,
like?
really?
What is the good life for a human being, and for a human individual, and for a human society? What does the good life look like? Right, that's the moral
Mm,
sciences. What does it mean to be good? And so economics would fall under that, and you talk about how ought a society organize itself, how ought because you're trying to find the good life. I don't Did you see the the speech from Tucker Carlson last Friday?
I did at the Heritage. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really good. But that's one of the things that he says is, up till recently, we were all trying to figure out what the good life is. And we all thought that's what we were doing. And you thought Keynesian, I thought, you thought Keynesian, you thought Keynesian economics, and you thought Austrian economics, and we would write papers, but we agreed that we were trying to find the good life. And he says, that's gone. We are not in agreement with everybody anymore that you're trying to find the good life. Um, but that
Yeah.
is the history of education, right? Is you've got a body of knowledge, called the moral sciences, that are all seeking the good life for mankind. What is it? For good life for an individual, the good life for society. And you're having a conversation over the generations to try and discover the best ways to support and move towards and encourage and the good life. Um, and that the an educated person knew the basics of the history of the conversation, where they were in the conversation right now, and could interact with it. And that's what education meant. So the natural sciences, it was how does creation function? Where did it come from? Um, how does it function? How do we bring it to its intended end? You know,
Is
something
that
like farming.
Is that okay? Yeah. How intended in?
Yeah,
That's not
teleological, I
eschatological.
think, is
Okay, teleological.
usually
Okay,
called
got it.
teleological. What's the purpose for which God gave us? Let's say you discover hops, right? And you say, well, what is it? Well, it's a grain, and it grows this way, and how do I grow it best? And then what's it for? And then you make beer, and you're like, that's what it's for. I've discovered the
Right,
intended
right.
purpose of hops, right? Um, and so that and there so there's metaphysical questions. Where did creation come from? um God created it, is how we answer. God created with a particular intention. And then there are practical questions: how to grow it best, when do you plant? All of those things would fall under the natural sciences. And so that's physics, chemistry, or what was called alchemy until fairly recently, but now we call it chemistry because alchemy sounds too much like magic. But most of our chemists in the past were actually alchemists, but that was more of a switch in. We had a switch in cosmology where alchemy now sounded disreputable, and so we came up with chemistry, dropped the owl off the front. But and then farming, all of that, and then theology. Was called the queen of the sciences, because it contained within itself the answers that you needed to be able to answer the metaphysical questions about the natural and moral sciences. So you couldn't answer the metaphysical questions in the natural sciences without the queen of the sciences, because all of the metaphysical questions had to be bumped up to questions that were answered in the theological sciences, the divine sciences. So theological means science of God, or the study of God. But all the things that fall under knowledge of God, and and that was its own category. It got shifted to be under philosophy by the folks that started the French Revolution. So now theology is a subcategory of philosophy, because the encyclopedists, which were a French movement, they moved Diderot. He's the guy that did it. He reorganized all of the thought, all of the history of thought, and he put theology as a subset of philosophy, rather than the philosophy as a subset of both moral philosophy and metaphysical philosophy, right? So it used to be that philosophy was a subcategory in a couple of different sciences, with theological with the theology as the queen of the sciences over all of them. Diderot moved theology to a new spot, and so then Christianity became a sub philosophy of theology, which was a sub philosophy of philosophy, which was the sub philosophy of metaphysics. So you had this, and then we got rid of metaphysics. So then all you had to do was get rid of metaphysics, which happened it started with Nietzsche, and then was completed in the 60s, really, in the philosophy departments, was metaphysics went away. So, but to say I'm educated in a subject, would be to say I understand where this subject fits in the broader thought of the history of mankind, the broader conversation, and then I know the conversation of this particular subject, where this subject comes from, is where it started, and then the major players within it. So so knowledge is a historical, the same muse that is responsible in classical thought is responsible for memory and history.
Muse, individual the same memory, muse. You said with the same muse. What is muse?
Okay. So the muses.
Sorry, I had to take you off.
No, that's okay. The Olympian muses were the 9 spirits of inspiration of the arts. So and this is mostly used just straight metaphorical. There's some stories in Hesiod. There's some stories in Homer. They're mentioned in Homer, but so you've got the 9 muses, epic poetry. I gotta grab the list. I try to have all this memorized, but unfortunately.
Wait, well, why you working on that? So it was moral science. What was the other one?
Natural, moral, and divine sciences.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Here's the Olympian muses. So, and these were considered the affection tuning arts. So these were the arts that tuned our affections. So the 9 muses were the divine inspirations behind the different art forms that then tuned the affections of mankind. Right. So they were the ones that gave us the gut reaction to whether something was good and true, because they attuned our loves with their beauty. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
This is why this is all gone from our education, because we think we're creating,
Yeah.
we think we're, this is why. So freedom, oh man, it's all
Can-
connected.
Okay. So hold on. I got to say this because this is the difference now. I think you made me read The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, right?
Yes,
And one of the things he made clear, there's a difference between symphonic understanding of the cosmos versus um, a cog, mechanical,
mechanistic,
right?
yeah.
And it seems like you're building off of the symphonic reality of the universe in
Exactly.
this.
Yeah,
Okay.
so behind all of this is a different cosmology. Because so the reason it's called the liberal arts, is that it's the, the it is the education that you give a free person. Right? The same word that liberty comes from, is liberal
Libre.
arts, right? Yeah, the arts, it's the education that you give to a free person. Freedom is a blessing in a symphonic musical setting, right? And you go to a great jazz concert, and the man who his fingers are freed from having to think through what he has to push to get what sound, is the one who gives gives you the best saxophone solo. The freedom, so freedom to you. I remember the first time I heard New Orleans marching jazz. It blew me away. You pick any particular person and pull them aside, and it doesn't. It might be cool, but it doesn't sound like music. It doesn't sound amazing. It doesn't sound the trombone, might go doont doont doop doont,
Right.
and you're
Right.
like, okay, that's cool, but
Whatever.
and then you've got doom 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 doom, doom, with the bass drum, and then but you take all of those musicians all playing one small part, and you put them together, and no single person is playing the music, right? It is a music that is all played together. It's a symphonic type of marching music, and then but they're all free to kind of play whatever they want, and that's the thing that gives it its joy and its exuberance, and the thing that makes it so that nobody can stand still and stay still, right? Is the freedom. Freedom within a symphonic universe is what gives it. You get more energy. You get, but freedom, in a watch, means it's broken, right? If you've got a free cog, then somebody has to get in there and tighten it up and make it not free anymore so that the watch works, right? In a machine, freedom is bad. In physics, the free radical is the enemy, right? Like
Right.
you
Right.
don't, right? So
It's
in a
cancerous.
mechanistic
Right.
universe, it's cancerous, right? Exactly. So in a mechanistic universe, freedom is an enemy. You have to get rid of freedom in a mechanistic universe. You and
Oh my
in
goodness.
the education that we give our kids now, and with a mechanistic cosmology, makes their gut reaction to freedom terror. Right, their gut reaction to freedom is terror, because it's a mechanistic universe. Everything has to be in line and in its place, right? Well, in a symphonic understanding of the cosmos, which is actually what reality is like, freedom is a blessing. Freedom is what you want. Freedom, and you want freedom for everybody, because the freedom of the individuals actually reinvigorates and society, and pushes it forward and moves the conversation ahead. You meet somebody who is a free thinker in a mechanistic universe, that's dangerous. A free thinker in a symphonic universe is a blessing, right? And that's how different um, the classical world was when all of the classical education was developed. It was the basic understanding was that the good life fundamentally necessitated freedom.
Mm.
The scientific education, the free life fundamentally necessitated lack of freedom. You had to be turned into the cog that fit the machine properly without the freedom
Pure
to
precision.
mess
Yeah.
everything up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's so completely fundamentally different that what used to be just called education, right? Liberal education is what it was called. The education of a free man. They end up now calling it a classical education because it's from before everything went wrong.
Oh,
Um,
that's insane. I just got done. It's insane. I just got done watching this guy on MSNBC talk about how classical education was racist. But why did we? But that's insane to think that when the idea of a classical education is a liberal arts education, which is a free man's, I remember the first time I heard Ben Merkel talk about classical education. He's like, a liberal arts education is a free man's education. And maybe it's just because of the culture I was in and where we're at. All of a sudden, all my antennas when okay, you got my attention. How we gonna get this freedom then? Right? Give it to me, put it on me,
But think about the definition of freedom that comes with something like critical theory. The definition of freedom is I'm at the top and can take everybody else's freedom. There is a point at the top that is free, and you know that you're free because everybody else is not free.
Mm.
Right? Critical theory is a Machiavellian mechanistic understanding of the world, right? That the only way to have freedom is to take it from everyone else. So in that situation, if you are, I don't know, if you're saying we're classical education, which means we reject critical theory, then they're a threat to your freedom. You've got to get rid of them, right? I mean, I don't know. I haven't watched the clip, so I don't know exactly what he means, but my guess is it's something like that.
You want me to play it?
Right?
I don't want to. I'm more concerned about what you're saying than I am what he's saying, because I think you're right with critical theory anyway. And the way that I know that we're operating in critical theory is that we don't see that stuff and be like, I'm gonna go back and teach my kids. Like, well, we operate almost in the same way. It's like, and I'm gonna just come over here and go to the top. Since you think if you're at the top, you're gonna be in control. I'm gonna go to the top now, and I'm gonna execute that you can't have any of this stuff. And it's like,
right,
well,
exactly. I mean, because you see that happening now in places where you think, okay, how is it that we're going to stop critical theory? It's like, well, we got to vote somebody in that outlaws it.
Right.
That's critical theory. What do you mean? We're not stopping critical theory. You are enforcing critical theory at that point.
Because now they just got to get more people to get up there. And then.
So, but the difficulty is what Tucker Carlson talked about, how not every, he said, if the question is, am I allowed, I want to be allowed to medically deform children.
Right.
He said, we're not in the same conversation anymore. We're not seeking the good life together like we used to be. So if that's the question, then what do we do? If our answer is we better grab the reins of power and yank real hard, and take then we're in trouble. We aren't thinking like free men. Right now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't outlaw things like that. Although the reality is those things are already outlawed.
I was gonna say that's
yeah. They are already breaking laws on the books. And that's the mistake I think that a lot of our legal system is making, is that those things have been outlawed for a long time in common law, in just in our legal system. So
okay,
we've got to figure out how to make some better legal arguments, maybe.
I don't think we need to make the arguments that we're needing to make aren't legal ones. This is where
if you're a lawyer, I mean, if you're a lawyer and that's where your calling is, and you're at the fight at that level.
No, Jason, I disagree with you there, though, because I think this goes back to, I'm going to argue with you. Moral sciences, natural sciences, divine, right? And everybody is working in one of those. And this is what's been so amazing. Okay, I got to talk about the conference coming up May 13th out in Nashville, because this is hitting right with some of the things we're going to deal with. I'm watching David Fowler, who is a lawyer, not argue so much law as the thing that sets up the reality of law.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you don't have the queen of the science, go ahead.
I've got a pre-copy of his new book. I'm reading it right now. So
who? Fowler's new book?
Yeah. I'm reading it.
David.
It's game changer.
David. How is it? Yeah. You know what? I don't understand how you got a copy of it. I didn't get a copy of it. I don't understand. I'm checking my email. Did he really send you a copy and not send me a copy? Doggone it.
Yeah.
Wow.
I didn't know he didn't send you a copy, but
we found out now, didn't we?
Yeah.
Well, look at that. I don't see
you're right.
Copy.
He's arguing at the he's arguing at the foundation level. He's saying
yes.
He's saying you're building a legal argument on sand over there, right? That's a sand.
And he's using history. He's historic. Like you said, this is a historical conversation, right? That this is when an educated person is ultimately having a historical conversation one way or the other, right? And so even as a lawyer right now, to argue law, you have to ask yourself, what is the tradition that's been handed down to us in God's law, it's common law, that shows us, oh, this is how we deal with the situation, or this is what we've done before. But you have to, go ahead. I'll let you finish it, because I want to get back to how you develop then this kind of education.
Yeah, right. And I think that's exactly the thing, is you say, okay, so what do I do about it? Well, the reality is, and this is where why the muses are so important, and why so the idea of the muses is that they're there's the inspiration of the 9 arts. Now, whether or not the 9 arts are exactly the right ones, or if there's more than that or less than that, or some of them can be combined, that's a debate that's really fun to have and all that. But they had an idea that there were the 9 basic arts, and this is the inspiration of the muses. When an art was inspired by the muse, you knew that because it tuned the affection of the one who received the art towards a gut reaction. By its beauty, it tuned our gut reactions to recognize truth and goodness at that gut level.
Is this why you wrote the book, No One Doubts a Belly Laugh?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, exactly. Because you start to realize this stuff, and you realize you can't just explain this to somebody, that it doesn't work that way. It has to be communicated in the arts. But the Edith Schaefer wrote a wonderful book about the arts of homemaking that my wife and I read when we were newlyweds, and how homemaking is an art that shapes the soul of children. Right? And so
and they want to take the women out. Hold on, time out. And they trying to take. I'm sorry, we're not going to get anywhere. When you see that the social programs are trying to create daycares to take women out of the homes so they can go work. They're destroying the heart's passion of a child to develop under a culture of a family, to have their
Yeah,
passions geared a particular way so that they can gear the passions of your children a particular way. I mean, Biden just came out recently and said that your kid is everybody else's kid. And I was like, yo,
yeah, back the hell off.
for real, bro. Now I'm about to go
Right?
grab them gun. Anyway, go ahead, Jason.
But it's so that the education of young children, um, uh, I like to think of it as soulcraft through beauty, right? That's what moms do.
Oh,
Right? They build and shape souls through beauty, through beautiful food, beautiful houses, beautiful music, beautiful speech. Right there, the way a mom talks to their baby is it's always so amazing, right? And it's not something that I it's something that I learned from my wife. How do you talk to a baby? Right? Because she would hold the baby and she would talk to the baby, and you think the beautiful words, even just like, a mom that gets up and gets ready in the morning, um because they value their kids, right? They get up and they get ready and they get dressed and all of those things that not that they have to like put on a ball gown every day, but just getting up and saying, I'm getting dressed for the day, and purposefully trying to dress in a way that's beautiful. There's an appropriate kind of beauty for the kind of work that you do in a home, because it's not like, because you're still going to work every day. But it's but just even that, it's forming the souls of her children towards Christ, who is truth, who is goodness, who is beauty, right? So this is where that the arts are so important in a young. So our word musical comes from the muse, the muses. So it's a the it Plato. So Plato's in the Republic. I think this one of the things that he's most one of the places he's done the most damage in the church is his theology of music. But he has an explanation of why music is so important, and then he has a description of music that is pagan. And we need to be able to take his explanation of why music is so important and not accept his definition of what makes good music good, or because it's drawn out of in the Republic, music and poetry are for the control of the population, to make them accept their place in the society, right? It's a very cog in the machine mindset. But he says music is the way we're going to form our citizens well, because music has a formative effect on the deepest aspects of their affections, right? Music through rhythm and melody, and eventually harmony, although they didn't really have a concept of harmony. That's something that came with post-Trinitarian music. Actually is where harmony was developed. But the melody and the rhythm, he said, gets within us, right? Physically, it actually resonates beyond our skin, which is true, and that's part of what he's saying. But he also understands that it actually has an effect on our affections, because of its beauty, right? And so then he says what we need is, basically marches and no polyrhythms, and kind of that consistently thumping music that keeps a person in line, right? Like a political rave almost. That's a terrible That's a terrible analogy. But in the Republic, he has this whole section about and the church has looked at the first part and said, yes, that's absolutely true. And then looked at the second part and said, well, maybe he's right about that. Maybe we should actually have this as well. And so he doesn't want any new music. He wants the music to not come from people, but to always come from the government top down, things like that, because it's music are a means of control. And if you have music that's too emotional, then you'll lose control of the people. Well, the Psalms talk the exact opposite way. David says, that the Lord rejoices in a new song. Hey, it's a new day. Let's write a new song. He talks a lot about the emotional effect of music as a good thing. They have all different kinds of instruments, rhythmic as well as tonal music in the Psalms, right? A lot of when people get really influenced by Plato, the church music is straightened out. Any polyrhythms are removed. The harmonies have a tendency to be straightened out, or we only sing in unison and we reject harmony. And then no new music is allowed. It's good because it's old, is a Platonic argument. Like not Neoplatonic in a Gnostic way, actually an argument made by Plato. So that if it's old, it's good, and if it's new, it's bad. That's not a Christian concept of music. Those are some of the things that the Protestant church in particular has brought in from Plato. But the reality is all of the arts work the same way music does, right? That they're all the arts are musical or muse-ish. I don't know.
So then what are the 9 muses then?
All right.
And they and just to make sure, and all of them in some way, music is I don't know, not the gateway drug, but it's the thing that deciphers all of it too. So you put music in or you put these into music to get them into people.
Well,
is that fair?
No,
it's part of it.
I think what you would say. So music is one of the muses, but our word music has come to mean only one of the 9 muses.
Okay, I got you.
When actually all 9 of them function that way, right? So when they talk about the function of the muses, all of them function the way we know music works. But we've dropped the rest of them.
So
not quite the rest of them, but we've dropped a lot of them.
So music is muse, period. The idea of muse is like storytelling. It gets past watchful dragons, like way music
exactly
does.
So it's all of the arts that affect us at the level of the affections
and that's education.
That's the beginning of education.
Right? Okay, so what's the
so here's what they are. So eloquence and epic poetry is the first one.
Eloquence and epic poetry. What is that?
So epic poetry is, Homer, Virgil, Milton.
Stuff you've been bringing me along on.
Yeah. So it's the long form poetry that requires, so the eloquence, it's storytelling poetry, I guess is how you would put it. So it's that long form storytelling. And so the eloquence has to do with the when somebody tells you a story and you can't help but listen. That's eloquence.
Okay.
Right? It's that ability to captivate you and draw you completely in to a story. So epic poetry is that. And then history and memory. So history is like corporate memory. And then individual memory, so that things that a people group know and things that we individually know. So the stories from history. Erato is the muse of lyric and erotic poetry. Right. So this is the shorter poetry.
What's erotic there?
Erotic would be like love poetry between a man and a woman.
Like so Psalms, or I mean, not the Song of
Psalms.
Solomon.
They got the Song of Solomon. So Psalm 45, I think, is the only love poem in the Psalter, but then Song of Solomon. But this is most of our, so that, like, so much of our popular music, this is where it fits, right? It's this eroto, it's the lyric and erotic poetry. And this is, so a Christian, if something is going to be considered a Christian music, it has to, it has to actually, so polyhymnia is the muse of sacred poetry. We have
Is that
taken
number
sacred
4?
poetry. Well, it's actually number 6. I'll get them
Okay.
all out in order.
All
So,
right. All right. All right.
next is music, and then tragedy. So sad stories, and then sacred poetry, polyhymnia. So our word hymnal, hymns, songs to God,
Mm,
comes from this muse, right? So this is where, if it's on a Christian station, it has to be inspired by polyhymnia. But that means we have left all the other muses to the pagans. So our kids, if they want a
interesting.
love poem, they don't get love poems from Christians. All their love poems are on their phone in their pocket, are from non-Christians. But that's an essential part of forming their moral imagination and of forming their moral affections, is their how they understand love poetry.
God thought so.
But
That's
we
why
don't,
he gave
right?
us Song of Solomon.
Exactly, right? Um, so, and then you've got dance.
Dance.
Terpsichore is one of the uh, affection tuning arts. Comedy and astronomy, which astronomy comes up all the time. It was so central to who we are as human beings, is what how we treat the sky when we look up. And we
Interesting.
literally don't even do that anymore. We don't stop and look up. So the ancients, and then the Christian, so one of the things that you see all the time in Christian architecture, Christian art, is the muses painted in the background, right? You see the muses carved into walls. You see the muses, all sorts, right? Because they understood that, how important the tuning of the affections was, how important the formation of our affections towards goodness and truth was, by the beauty of the arts. We have walked away from that. Now we still write hymns. We're
Well, what
starting
we
to realize we've got to make some, we that music is important. Um, you're starting to get some, comedy that happens in churches and things, but we don't send out comics in, the church doesn't raise up comics that go out to the comedy stores and comedy, and to the comedy
wow.
stages that are all over, and rock them. We should be doing that, though. We should be sending out Christians that rock comedy stages, because they're so good at comedy, because they're inspired by the muse to go make the truth and goodness beautiful by comedy.
Well,
But
and
it's
they're operating with all 9 of these too, though, right? So they're able to have
mhm.
a deep bag of
Yeah,
communication.
exactly. Right. These are, so we, I mean, eh, when we were down in LA, Marcus and I go to comedy, uh, underground comedy everywhere we go. It's because underground comedy is one of the most powerful forces in our societies, that guides our society, right? And so I like to know where we're going, and so but we were at one comedy shop, and it was a night of conservative comedy. It um it, it was called, you know Laughter for America or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was called. It was amazingly good comedy. 5 comics plus an MC that were all well, 4 of the 5 comics knocked it out of the park, and then the MC was hilarious. And but it was really interesting. We get there, you sit down, and it's just like any comedy store, 2 drink minimum, and all the normal things that go with going to a comedy shop of some sort. But at the beginning, they all stood up and sang the national anthem together, incredibly, loud and emotionally singing the national anthem. And then they sit down, and the comedy was really funny. One guy comes out, I think he might have been the only Christian comic up there. He was a new Christian. He was also the only comic that used swear words, which was interesting. But he got up and he said, he says, if many of you are like me, this whole pandemic has shifted a lot of things about the way you view the world. He said, look, who would have known a guy named Lefkowitz would ever end up baptized, something like that, because he's a Jewish guy. And he's like, but I'm newly baptized, and a bunch of people cheer. And he was, I was the best, he said, but there's one thing I've realized reading the Bible is God told us we're only allowed to cut off a little bit of our penises. Right? Now, he did not bring up, he was not like trans this, trans that, right? He wasn't making, he didn't have to bring up anything.
But boy, what a joke.
What a joke, right? That is a well-crafted, well thought out joke that is punching back specifically against one of the major lies of our culture, but punching back in such a affection forming way, right? Where the place blew up in laughter, right? It was such a good joke. Another really good joke. There was another Christian comedian, because the last guy that came up was Christian, and he was like, yeah, I'm a Lutheran, which means I'm a non-practicing Catholic.
I got a Lutheran guy here who's gonna love that.
It's such a good joke, right? But it's not it. But comedy is an affection forming art, right? And you use it well by loving the truth yourself, by loving goodness yourself, by growing in your own sanctification, growing in the Lord, and then getting really good at your craft, so that the things that you love and the things that you hate, you can make them attractive and unattractive through the art form. That's what the arts are for. The arts are they're for a lot of things, right? They're for the human connection and the translation of truth and the translation of survival information. And there's a lot that art does. But in an educational setting, right? It's about the formation of the affections towards goodness and truth through beauty. And each of them has their own historical conversation, right? If you this as a director, if you meet somebody who's like, I want to be a director, and you say, oh, what was the last movie you watched? And they tell you, and you're like, oh, what's your favorite movie? And they haven't seen a movie that's more than like 18 months or 2 years old. Then you probably tell them the same thing I do, which is like, well, you don't really want to be a director yet. I'll know you want to be a director when you're out there studying the great directors of the past, trying to figure out how'd they do that, right? You gave me, when I was saying, well, I don't know if I ever want to direct, you gave me master shots.
Yeah,
you said,
yeah, I gave you a bunch of them, didn't I?
You gave me a stack of them. If you find these, if you look at these and you can't put them down, then you want to be a director. Right? And I read through all of them. I'm marking them up before too long, and I'm like, yeah, you're right. But that's exactly it, right? Here is that's the equivalent of a history of the craft of camera work,
right? That's exactly right.
Master shot set. So this is somebody that has compiled the history of the craft of camera work in storytelling, and they're incredible, and that's how I knew that at some point I do want to direct, because that stuff is so
It's fascinating.
exciting,
So
right?
then where do you so these 9 muses, how do you get these in you? How do you, what is the, and I gotta run in like 10 minutes, but how do you, sorry man, we don't have to do a couple on these. This is
I
really, this
warned you
is,
yesterday. I
you're
was like,
right.
I
No,
think
this
this is
is like
going
an
to take a
introduction.
couple.
Yeah, no, this is an introduction because um I've, the more that I begin, I become more literate, the more I love it, right? And the more I wish I had more time for it. And that's just why I'm telling my kids, like, listen, daddy got y'all from here until you're 18, 19. If you decide to go further, I'll cover it, I'll cover
Yeah,
it so you can do this. But get all of this, get every last bit of it, because it's bigger than just getting a job. It's bigger than just being able to go and work somewhere. I want you to be a blessing to the world, right? Like that's what this. I want you to be a blessing to the world. I want you to inspire people to say, "Wow, what a great God!" Through comedy or through, I don't care if it's fixing breaks. I just want you to be a master at it and use
right,
all of these things in that form. And so the more that I'm becoming educated, the more and more are literate, the more I'm understanding this. But there is one thing to just go and read books. It's another thing to have um the joy of it. Is that right? Or the
yeah,
in the same way that you laugh at a joke, is that kind of thing that bubbles up inside of you, where you have that because of beauty, right?
right. Well, and I think
As a father, I feel
the
responsibility to get that desire for my children. So what is it? Where do you start at?
I mean the it comes down to things like, you know, making sure the things that you love, you love them in front of your kids, right? I think that's the beginning of it. So if if there's, music or poetry or something that you're like, man, I love this, that you love it with your kids, in front of your kids, that you express to them what it looks like to really love and enjoy something. And often as fathers, we have a tendency in this setting to think that if we are emotionally expressing our love of something because that we find moving or beautiful, that we are lowered in our children's eyes, right, by those expressions of emotion. I mean, for whatever reason, anger is not something that we think lowers us in our children's eyes, so we don't have any problem with that. But really expressing our love of something, like, if the music that you grew up with, telling the story. Oh man, I remember the first time I heard this. Oh, I love this song. Oh, I love, oh, I love this poem. I love this story. I love this novel. Just really loving beautiful things in front of your kids. My kids have been forced to listen to my favorite operas. They don't love opera yet, but I want them to see me loving opera, right? Me singing a bad Figaro is really, really
Figure.
important and powerful. Yeah, exactly. Right. Singing along. Like um, I don't have a great operatic voice. Um, but if I've got, the operas that I really love, I can sing along through the whole thing. Right. And they've heard me sing bad opera, but it's because I want them to understand this is something beautiful. Your dad loves it. Your dad loves this beautiful thing. I think their musical tastes will grow into it. I didn't love opera when I was a little kid. Opera is hard and it's complex and it's deeply emotional. And when I was, I didn't, God hadn't dug my wells of emotion deep enough to really experience um, opera until my mid 20s. That's when those wells of emotion were finally deep enough to be able to hear the flower duet and go, "Oh, I've felt that before." Right? I hadn't felt anything that deeply. Until
That
you start having kids and the fears that come with raising kids, or the fears of taking your kids to the hospital and loving something so much and being afraid it's going to be taken away. Something like the flower duet, and hearing the love being taken away, you recognize that emotion now, and you can see the beauty of that fear, that comes from the love of loss, or the fear of loss that comes from love, that I couldn't when I was 18, 19. Like I just hadn't experienced enough life to be able to feel along with some of the depth of emotion that you get in opera. But I want my kids to see that, to see me loving that, and I want my kids, when they find a new piece of music that they love, for them to come to me and say, "Hey, Dad, I just found this new band. I really like them. What do you think?" Right? And so, if you spend all of your time criticizing, your kids move the other way when they find something they love, because they don't want to hear you criticize it. Right? If you lead with criticism, if you lead with the things that you don't like, if you lead if they know you're a critic, then when they find something they love, they don't bring it towards you. But if they've seen you love things that are beautiful, and they know that that's your default, is the love of beauty, not criticism, then you get those opportunities to walk through things with your kids, and they might bring you something, then you're like, I don't get it. Explain to me why you love this. Explain to me, right? And that opens opportunities for conversations about, I remember talking to one dad who was saying, "Man, my kids, my boys, they love this heavy rock and roll, and all I've ever listened to is folk music. I just don't get it. It's just tearing us apart." And my advice at the time was, go ask them what the next album they want is, buy it for them, buy yourself a copy, listen to it, and then go sit down and say, help me understand why you love this. If you find that there's something in there, that a misformed affection, then you can talk to them about it. But
Interesting.
you can't talk to them about it if all you say is, that stuff is terrible, it's awful. Now, if they're bringing home, like, the only time my parents ever made me return an album was Blood
The
Sugar Sex
Chronic.
Magic.
Oh,
Well, the Chronic, that would be a good one. Had I brought that
yeah.
home, they would have made me bring it. And that's one you listen to and you can say, let me explain to you why we're returning this. I mean, you can't return stuff anymore, it's all streaming or whatever, but let me explain to you. And if they don't see it now, they'll see it as they grow older, right? Especially if they know, like, my dad loves Earth, Wind, and Fire, so I know it's not just that he's just prejudiced against beats, or or something, that you can say, like, no, they don't, Snoop Dogg does not speak well about women. Right? That's something that is not good. It's objectively not good, the way Snoop Dogg talks about women, right? That's
Right.
You can have those conversations if they know my dad loves beautiful stuff. So it's not that, right? It's something else. The But if 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 you're always a critic, you end up not getting an opportunity to criticize anything with your kids. That's the reality. If criticism is the norm.
Okay, so where are we gonna? There's so much I want to say, and I have to run. But there's so much I want to say and add to this. I want to talk about my hot dog story, but I can't talk about my hot dog story now.
Well,
We'll talk
I
about it
think that'll
next
be
show.
yeah. Let's talk about that on the next show, because I think that's the ticket, right? Is what does it look like to move your kids towards move teach your
I think you
kids
have.
how to be moved by beauty, because that's one
Yeah,
of our
you.
jobs as a dad, is to teach them how to be moved by beauty.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So we'll talk about that next. Okay, I've started talking about not the conference, the event, March or May 13th. May 13th is going to be in Nashville. You can go find out more. FLFnetwork.com. Jason Farley, George Grant, David Fowler, and myself. And I think Doug Tenaple is going to be there, and he doesn't know it, but he might be on stage with us. And there's only room for 50 people. This is a small, intimate event. We're going to try and help rebuild a biblical cosmology. Basically, some of the things we're talking about here, but with a different topic. And since we have David Fowler is going to be within law, common law, those type of things, and then George Grant, to help reorder our passions through storytelling. It's just so good. Go sign up. I
Okay.
think we're close to full. So if you're going to do it, you should do it quickly. I'm looking forward. Knox Unplugged has been such a blessing to me, just having these conversations with Jason. And I just want to do these everywhere. I would love to see him in New York. I would love to see him in California. I love to see him in Texas, in Florida, in Kansas City, in Minneapolis, South Carolina. Just so my guy, Daniel Aaron Spratt hit me up. He's like, "You forgot about us out here in Kansas." Like, I didn't forget about y'all. We got Missouri, Kansas. We there. We'll do them out there too. So sign up right now, flfnetwork.com. Did I forget anything else?
I don't think so.
What's the name of the event again? The world dies when the metaphor ends, right?
The world dies when the metaphor ends. Exactly.
That's the name of the event. It's going to be phenomenal. I can't wait. So, and it's so hard to do this show and not talk about that event.
Yeah.
But I think all of this is building up to that. So next we'll talk about my hot dog story, and we'll get into education, shaping and forming the passion. Soulcraft, right? It's just called the Soulcraft,
Yeah.
Right? Soulcrafting.
Yeah,
What do you call it?
that's yeah. So crafting
Soul
souls
craft
through
through
beauty.
Crafting souls
Yeah,
through
soul
beauty.
craft through beauty.
Introduction.
Introduction.
That's what this is. Soul crafted through beauty introduction. And then